Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on visiting or v gostiach. Visiting or going to dinner parties and going to visit people at their houses is a very important part of Russian culture. As you can see from the picture, people like to put on a lavish spread and have big parties. So you'll learn some important vocab and some important cultural tips about how to participate in such parties in this lecture. This section of the chapter is mainly about vocab memorization, so I'd like you to focus on memorizing the vocab on these 2 pages. But this is also a great time to go through verb conjugation and review some verb conjugation and review how aspectual pairs work and how you can form perfectives from imperfectives and imperfectives from perfectives. So I wanted to start off by going through the verbs on page 292. As you can see, right at the top of the page on exercise 1116, there's a list of phrases that have to do with visiting and going to parties. And these all have verbs, and most of these verbs you know, some of them you may not be familiar with, so now is a good time to review them. So I'm just going to go through them, and it might be a little tedious, but you really do need to know these verbs and know their conjugations. So let's start with getting up from the table. Wstawać or wstać iz-za stola. And you've already learned this phrase, but let's review the conjugation of this aspectual pair, wstawać, which is imperfective, and wstać, which is perfective. And this is a common forming of an aspectual pair where the imperfective is an ava verb, and then the perfective is an an verb. You'll see what I mean in a second. So wstawać is an ava verb. And if you remember how ava verbs are conjugated in the non-past, which is always going to be the imperfective, so the present, all ava verbs are imperfective. We're going to drop the va and then add a stressed first conjugation ending. So ja wstaju, ty wstajesz, ani wstajut. And the past is completely regular with no stress shift. So wstawał, wstawała, wstawali. The perfective of this kind of verb, specifically the stawać verbs, and there's a group of them. So the perfective of these stawać verbs, including wstawać, is stać. And here, of course, it's wstać, starting with a v. You can put various prefixes in front of stać, and it will have different meanings. Here we have v, so wstać. And the perfective we make by adding an n into the conjugation. And then we add an unstressed first conjugation ending. So wstanu, ja wstanu, ty wstaniesz, ani wstanut. And the past, again, is perfectly regular without a stress shift. So wstal, ana wstala, ani wstali. So that's that kind of aspectual pair, the stawać and stać group of verbs, of which wstawać and wstać are the most commonly used verb. We now have an aspectual pair of verbs of placement and positioning, klást położyć, which is to lay down. And if you remember, Russian doesn't have a single verb that means to put. It has multiple verbs of placement and positioning, which always indicate in what position you're putting something. Klást and położyć is to lay down horizontally. And klást is one of these st verbs that end in st miachiznak in the infinitive. And we've seen a few of them, like ukrast. And when we see this st ending, we know that it normally gets a d in the conjugated form. So that s becomes d, and then we add our first conjugation endings because these are always first conjugation. And klást is n-stressed throughout the non-past paradigm. So ja kladu, ty kladiosh, ani kladut. The past, as is normally the case for these st miachiznak verbs, these ast verbs, is completely regular with no stress shift. You just drop the infinitive ending, which includes the sa, and add the regular past tense endings. So on klal, ana klala, ani klali. And this is one of those aspectual pairs that appear to be made up of two completely different verbs. In fact, klost and pologit are probably related, that you have this lad, loj root that's probably related. But as far as we're concerned, they're completely different verbs. We also have the formation of an aspectual pair in which the imperfective is first conjugation and the perfective is second conjugation. So that's pretty common as well. And so we see pologit is second conjugation, and it's one of the many multisyllabic second conjugation words with a stress shift. And so я положу, ты положишь, они положат. Just like я получил, ты получишь, они получат. Я положу, ты положишь, они положат. And the past, as is normally the case with these kinds of verbs, is completely regular with no stress shift. So он положил, она положила, они положили. So that's that aspectual pair in which we have two verbs that appear to be completely unrelated, and that can happen sometimes. And again, we also have the imperfective is first conjugation and the perfective is second conjugation. That is pretty common. Our next aspectual pair, the last one on this slide, is nakrywać, nakryć. And as a side note, the textbook has nakrywać, nakryć na stol to set the table. You can certainly say that. You can also leave out the na. The na is optional. So both nakrywać or nakryć stol and nakrywać, nakryć na stol mean to set the table. Google gives me slightly more hits for nakryć stol without the na, but you also get almost 500,000 hits for nakryć na stol, so either one is totally fine. And here we have a particular kind of aspectual pair, the kryć verbs, and they all have krywać in the imperfective. So here we have nakrywać. You just have krywać and then whatever the prefix is. Here the prefix is na, so we have nakrywać. And it's just a completely regular first conjugation verb, just like czytać. So nakrywają, nakrywajesz, nakrywajut, on nakrywał, ona nakrywała, ani nakrywali. Kryć, as we discussed in the last lecture, has a vowel mutation, which you don't see a lot of in Russian, but you do for the kryć verbs, in which an o pops up out of nowhere. And all kryć verbs have the same conjugation, in which you have an o, and the o is always under stress, and then you add a first conjugation ending. So я накрою, ты накроешь, они накроют. And again, the past is completely regular with no stress shift. Он накрыл, она накрыла, они накрыли. Here we have this very common formation of an aspectual pair in which the perfective is shorter than the imperfective. In this case, the perfective is the root verb, and then we've created an imperfective by adding vat as the ending. And that's a very common way of creating an aspectual pair. And when that happens, it often conjugates completely regularly. So nakrywać just conjugates completely as we would expect. And so if you have this iva in the middle of a verb, it's very likely that it's imperfective. And then if you have it in your verb, at the end of your verb, it's very likely that it's perfective. Carrying on to the next pair, we have передавать, передать. And this is a very common aspectual pair, the dava-dat verbs. And there's lots and lots of them, and we've learned them, but this is a good time to review them because they're a little bit complicated. If you remember, all the dava verbs are a form of ava verb, and they're all imperfective, and they follow the rules for ava verbs. So передавать becomes передаю, передаешь, передают, and the past передавал, передавала, передавали, completely what we'd expect from an ava verb. And then the perfective, as all perfectives of dava verbs are, is a dats verb. And dats verbs are one of the few truly irregular verbs in Russian, if you remember. And it doesn't matter what prefix you put on them, they conjugate the same bizarre and irregular way. So we have piridam, piridash, piridast. Note that there's a s, t in the ending there for the o and ana form. Piridadim, piridaditya, piridadut. So notice in these singular forms, they're just completely unexpected, really weird things like piridam. Where does this M come from? We don't have M in the ya in most modern Russian verbs. This is a much older form. And then in the plural, it appears to switch over to second conjugation. And then all of a sudden in the ani form, it goes back to first conjugation. So that is weird, but that's what happens with dots verbs. And once you learn the paradigm, that's what they do. The past of dots verbs with prefixes can also be a little bit funky. And the thing about the past tense of dots verbs with prefixes is that the stress can shift all the way to the very first syllable of the verb. So the very beginning of the prefix in all forms except the ana form. So the on form of the past for piridat can be piridal, that's totally fine and normal and commonly used, or piridal with the stress on that first yeah. You might also encounter that. The ana form of all dots verbs has an N stressed, so piridala. The ano form can be piridala or piridala. Again, the stress can be either on that stem, that a stem, or at the beginning of the prefix. And same for the ani form, piridali or piridali. Personally, I use the form that seems more regular, piridal, piridala, piridali, but you want to be prepared when you encounter these other forms that's what people are saying. Again, that is a certain type of aspectual pair that has some very important verbs in it, these dava dots verbs. Our next aspectual pair is piec, to bake. And this is a very common and easy way to create a perfective from an imperfective where you just put a prefix on the front of an imperfective verb and you create a perfective verb. And the nice thing about that is you just have to learn one conjugation. So piec and piec both conjugate in exactly the same way. This is obviously a velar stem verb, and this is a velar stem with ka in its stem. We've seen g as in pamoch or moch. Piec has ka, and there's no way to tell from the infinitive, you just have to know. And so it conjugates just like any velar stem, but with ka and ch instead of g and j. So piku, pichosh, pikut, or ispiku, ispichosh, ispikut. And then the past is piok, spelled with a ka, pikla, pikli, or ispiok, ispikla, ispikli. So that's pretty straightforward as long as you remember how velar stem verbs work. Our next aspectual pair, saditse siest, is a type of rather unusual formation of aspectual pairs, but there are a couple like this. And this is where the imperfective is reflexive and the perfective is not. Another thing about it is that the imperfective is second conjugation and the perfective is first conjugation. And there's a couple of important pairs like that. Saditse siest, to sit down, is one of them. The other one is stanovitse stat, to become. Saditse, other than that fact that it's reflexive and its perfective partner is not reflexive, other than that, it's very straightforward. It has exactly what you'd expect from a verb like that. So, sajus, sadisha, sadiatsa. And the really nice thing about it is there's not even a stress shift. It's completely regular and easy to deal with. And so is the past, on sadilsa, ana sadilas, ani sadilis. Siest, its perfective partner, is a little more complicated. It's another st verb, another st miachkiznak verb. And like all st miachkiznak verbs, we get a d popping up. So we get rid of the infinitive st miachkiznak ending, we add d, and then we add a first conjugation ending. All of those verbs are first conjugation. But in this case, it's unstressed. Why? Because The other thing that happens is we get another vowel mutation. And sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, yeah will mutate into ya. And this happens here. So we have ja siadu, ty siadiesz, ani siadут. And the past, like all sitze mjachty znak verbs, is not end-stressed, it's stem-stressed. We just drop the ending and add the regular past tense ending, so siel, siela, sieli. Our next aspectual pair is another verb of placement and positioning. Stavit pastavit is to put or place or stand vertically. So we use stavit pastavit when you place something vertically, like you place a glass down vertically, as opposed to laying a fork down horizontally. You would place a glass vertically. And it's another one where you just create the perfective by adding a prefix, in this case, the super common prefix po. So that's super easy. And then the conjugation is exactly the same. The only thing that's exciting about this conjugation is that it's an avits verb, or a vits verb that's stem-stressed, like gatovit. And so we have this consonant mutation that you get in second conjugation verbs, where we add an L in front of the ya form. So stavlю or pastavlю. And then it disappears in the other forms, pastavish, pastaviet. The past is completely regular with no stress shift, pastavil, pastavila, pastavili. The thing to remember is that the imperative is going to be one of those rare mjachty znak imperatives. So pastav, pastavtia, with a mjachty znak. And now finally for our last pair, ubirats, ubrats, to clean or remove. And this is another one where the imperfective is longer than the perfective. And you see we've added another vowel in it. And so we have ira. And if you see an ira verb, chances are good that it's imperfective. And there's a whole bunch of brats, birats verbs in which the imperfectives all have birats and the perfectives all have brats. And just like the krivats verbs, the birats verbs are all imperfective and they're all completely regular. So ubirayu, ubirayesh, ubirayut, ubiral, ubirala, ubirali. The brats verbs are a little more complicated. The unprefixed form brats is imperfective. As soon as you add a prefix, it becomes perfective. So you have ubrats, sabrats, and so on and so forth. And these have a fleeting vowel that pops up when you add an ending. So ja ubiru, ty ubiriosh, ani ubirut. Again, it's first conjugation, so you add a stressed first conjugation ending and you insert a yeah before it. Ubiru, ubiriosh, ubirut. And the imperative is going to keep that yeah in it, ubiri. The past follows the rule for all brats verbs, so on ubral, ana ubrala with an N stress in the ana form, ani ubrali, stem stress in the ani form. So that is a quick review of those verbs, and try to memorize the verbs and try to memorize their conjugations. Another very important cultural moment that appears on these pages is making toasts, and they kind of jump over it pretty quickly, so I wanted to give you a little more background on it. Anytime you go to a party or any kind of a gathering, it's very likely that there will be toasts, probably multiple toasts. You don't normally drink without toasts. Normally you're supposed to drink only when people propose toasts, and you may be required to drink to the bottom when someone proposes a toast. So bear that in mind. To propose a toast is предлагать or предложить toast, and then za plus the accusative to the person or the thing that you're proposing the toast to. You can also say pít or vypít, za plus the accusative, to drink to someone. And it's very common to begin toasts by saying давайте выпьем за, let's drink to, as in давайте выпьем за Анну, давайте выпьем за нас, давайте выпьем за дружбу, So let's drink to Anna. Let's drink to us. Let's drink to friendship. You can also say, Поднимаем бокалы за. We raise our glasses to. So, поднимаем бокалы за Анну. Поднимаем бокалы за нас. Поднимаем бокалы за международную дружбу. We raise our glasses to Anna. We raise our glasses to us. We raise our glasses to international friendship. And it's not a very complicated form at all. If you memorize a couple of these constructions like давайте выпьем за and поднимаем бокалы за, you can then start proposing your own toasts, which you will probably be called upon to do.